I got this from Ollie. I was just talking to Ollie the other day, and he said, I don't want to box him in. He might change his mind, but he said he might base the class that you're going to have with him on technology on this conceptual framework. Now, that really doesn't limit him too much, because you see this conceptual framework has subject, rules, community, object, outcome. I mean, all these big ideas and all these arrows going in every which way. All right, so it's not very clear exactly what the statement is, but it's a framework for thinking about things. It's almost like a whole set of theories put into one map. And you would say that whatever I analyze, I'm going to analyze from within this way of thinking about how things interrelate. So you see it's still constructivist in how open-ended it is and how many different two-way relationships there are. All right, now those are the easy ones to me. Transformativist and pragmatist are a little bit more challenging. So I'm going to ask you two questions, and if you can, I want you to pause the video and think about it a second before you see what I'm going to say. All right. So first question, is a transformativist more like a positivist or a constructivist? Second question, how does pragmatism relate to theory? That first question, transformativists, I'm talking about how do they compare, which are they more like when it comes to the use of theory? All right, so here's my answer. I believe that a transformativist when it comes to theory is more like a post-positivist than a constructivist. This could be confusing because when it comes to methodology of research, a transformativist is going to use qualitative research, and that makes you think of constructivism and open-ended. And so there's a natural affinity there, you might think, for the relationship between transformativists and constructivists. But remember that a post-positivist views the world through a theoretical lens that explains a number of things. And that's the same thing that a transformativist does. If you think of Marcy and her dissertation, she had a critical race theory, and that theory explained everything that she was analyzing. She started with the theory, she applied the theory to her fact situation, and showed how the theory was true. Very much like a post-positivist. All right, pragmatism. And I would say that pragmatists think that theory is highly context-based. All right, and I'm going to do a few quotes from Dewey here. So I hope you're having some coffee and can keep yourself energized while you go through some of this stuff. All right. Now the reason I'm going to Dewey is because Dewey is known as the American pragmatist and the leading American theorist, educational theorist. So if I think of pragmatism, I can't help but think of Dewey. And so I find pragmatism very difficult to understand, so I can only do it by trying to understand Dewey. All right, first of all, I would ask you to read this quote from Dewey. Okay, so you see that for Dewey, and this is a quote from his book on reflection, for Dewey, what he really wanted was a questioning of theory. It wasn't that he completely ignored theory, but he wanted to question it. Right? So that's one thing to understand about Dewey. All right. The second thing that I understand about Dewey is that he always saw more than one theory at play in any situation, and usually saw two opposing theories that could explain any situation. So I could probably come up with hundreds, if not more, quotes from Dewey where he juxtaposed two different theoretical perspectives and saying neither was sufficient. So here's just 3 bullet points where I've done that. So the last bullet point, that education is the union of these two opposites. And that's what produces good education, neither art nor science by itself. So it's not quite right to say that Dewey is anti-theoretical, but he believes that theory is complicated in the fact that there's always opposing theories, and it's the art of combining these theories to a certain situation, and how you move forward and visualize in the future using two opposing theories is how you explain the world, or how you make progress in the world, I would say. All right, hope that muddied it up for you. All right, now let's get practical. What I want you to do. All right, the most important thing I think you can do at this point, before you get onto Module 7, is read all the posts of your peers and all of my responses to them. As I'm writing the responses, I had the experience that I'm sure a lot of you had as instructors, that after 3 or 4, you start to say the same things over and over again. And so I want you to be able to kind of see that, so that maybe this assignment was challenging for you, and you're not confident about what you're doing. Exactly, sort of maybe you are, but sort of maybe you're not. So if you could read a post, read my response, read a post, read my response, read a post, read my response, to the point where you would say, okay, I read, now that on the 4th one, I'm going to read the post, I could respond now because I get how this is going. And when you can get to that point of getting to kind of anticipate the kind of feedback that I'm going to get, that would be a sign of you getting the kind of confidence in this process of being able to define things that we're aiming for. In our first class, a lot of you said something to the effect of, what I want is to have confidence that I know what I'm doing is right as a researcher. So I would say when it comes to theory, if you can do what I've just said, you are achieving that goal. If you can only post something that seems to be right, but you weren't sure why it was right, then you're not at that goal. So I think at this point, read your peers' posts, read my responses, and try to think in the way that you could give feedback to a peer that would be somewhat along the same lines that I gave to your peer, to other folks in the class. All right, now then once you do that, you're confident that you could write a good research question based on this Compass Learning white paper. I want you to go ahead then and start Module 7. You're going to have to write a new research question, fix up the one you already had, or borrow somebody else's and fix it up, based on your understanding of how to write a good experimental research question. This is not going to be a mixed method study. It's going to be a pure experiment. So some of the how-to questions, you're going to have to leave those out. Write a good experimental question and write a script for the research the same as in the Creswell, I think it's chart 8.6. I've got the directions on D2L. Most important, I want you to ask good questions of your peers the same kind of way that a faculty member might ask you a question if you were proposing this script as your dissertation study. Now, what a faculty member is probably going to do is, when presented with a proposal, in their mind, they're going to have some kind of map of the relationships that they think really do underlie the study that's being, the research question that's being investigated. And they're going to see, are there important things that you're not considering, important variables that are not being controlled? And so those are the questions they're going to ask about. So for example, if this is Jamie's, I think, if Jamie has a couple confounding variables here, and there's nothing in her research methodology that accounts for it, then, and I'm reviewing her proposal, I'm going to say, hey Jamie, what are you going to do about the nature of the relationship between the student and the teacher? Because isn't that a primary influence on the outcome? And won't that confound your study? So that's a tough question, but Jamie's got to be ready for that. So the best way to get ready for that, I think, is kind of like the stepping into the researcher's shoe, but stepping into the shoes of the faculty member who's going to ask tough questions here. So now really the onus here is not on the person answering the question, but on the person asking the question. So I'm looking for you to be able to ask really good questions while being polite, but questions that will get at the heart of the issue, perhaps point somebody in the right direction, or maybe even point to the fact that the research has such a big problem in it, they got to start over. But you're doing somebody a favor when you do that because you're saving them a year's worth of work. Okay? All right. Looking forward to the rest of our work next week.